Hello there. My name is Cristina Mayor. I'm a historian here at the Edison and Ford Winter Estates in Fort Myers, Florida. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the painted phonograph horn and its history and place and interior design here in the US from the late 19th, early 20th century, why it was painted the way that it was, and moving through why it was so important in the history of the phonograph here. Let me see if this is tracking. There we go. So I'm going to start right at the beginning with Edison and the phonograph. Now, Edison is the inventor of the cylinder phonograph. He would invent it in the 1877, and in that year, he was about 30 years old. Prior to the phonograph, he had been working on improvements towards the telephone, as well as a dictating telegraph machine. Now, it's with these two inventions where he starts to establish more of a repertoire or knowledge of sound vibration, more or less. And so it kind of leads him to understanding or trying to find a way to record the human voice. And so by August of 1877, he designs his first phonograph, and it's built by his friend and Swedish engineer or mechanic, John Crucy. And I will say, this prototype that was built, it would shock Edison because it worked its first time through, and how rare does that happen? Now, by November, December of 1877 is when he would apply for and receive his patent for the tinfoil phonograph specifically. And so I have an image of it here. This tinfoil phonograph there is quite close in comparison to the original tinfoil phonograph that he would invent in that year. I will say, though, for the initial recording that did play through, it was quite faint, more or less metallic sounding, but it was still remarkable nonetheless. Now, this invention would give him the name the Wizard of Menlo Park, because people initially hearing this recording, they thought it was a trick, an illusion. Later to find out it was simply his invention. Now, I will note this presentation is about the phonograph horn. Where would the horn fit into this initial iteration? Well, there was no horn. If you see here, this kind of stumpy pipe facet attached to the phonograph, that was essentially the horn. It's called a sound box, and that's where Edison spoke. Mary Had a Little Lamb, which would be his first recording, and kind of function the same way when playing. I will note when it comes to the phonograph, it could not only play recordings, it can record itself on the same mechanism. It's all a matter of the diaphragm and the needle. So here, if you see in this image off to the right, that little kind of mechanism showcased above in the right-hand corner, that is a diaphragm or the phonograph diaphragm. Now, when you're playing a recording, the change, at least in later iterations for the phonograph, would be the changing of the diaphragm. That was the most important part. The diaphragm usually came with either a reproducing needle and a recording needle. So how you'd go about recording. Now, you would make sure you would have your phonograph set up with the recording needle attached to the diaphragm. You would simply then speak into a horn that would be added more or less later on in the 1880s. And once you spoke into the horn or played whatever tune you would like to have recorded, this vibration would carry through that horn, follow through the diaphragm, and the needle behind that diaphragm would etch all those sound waves into the cylinder as it's rotating along the machine. And then for playing back any recordings, it kind of happened just in reverse. You would replace the recording needle for the reproducing needle. And once you switch your phonograph to rotate and play, that needle would just read all the sound waves that were etched into that cylinder. And the vibrations would then be read back through the diaphragm and amplified into the horn. So I will say the horn was quite an important tool in the phonograph because it not only helped with recording, but it would greatly amplify this sound, which theoretically would help many people listen to the phonograph. Now, I will say when it came to initial recordings of entertainment phonograph cylinders, I do have this image here from 1892 in Edison's laboratory, and you can see here how massive these horns are attached or close in proximity to these pianos and musical instruments, because the louder the horn, the better it would be able to record more clearly onto these cylinders. It does take quite a lot to have the needle vibrate. So, the larger the horn, the better. Now, I do have a timeline here that goes through the phonograph that I like to point out simply to also point out how the horn was developed through the initial invention of the cylinder phonograph in 1877. So here in August, we have that initial creation, more or less, and then December of 1877, Edison files for his patent, and by 1878, he was the patent holder of the tinfoil phonograph. I will say in that year, though Edison has this wonderful creation, another invention catches his eye, the light bulb. And so within that year, 1878, he kind of switches from the phonograph and off to the light bulb and the electrical systems attached. But it's not to say there was many people who found this invention quite intriguing, such as Alexander Graham Bell. And so in the 1880s, though Edison isn't prevalent, more or less, many competitors would arise in that decade to bring up many more of these different inventions or kind of go into this industry or form it, I would say. Now, I would say in the 1880s as well, the phonograph does not take on the reputation as an entertainment mechanism, at least not yet. In the 1880s, the phonograph is predominantly used as a business device. The idea behind it was that businesses could theoretically record meetings, messages that needed to go out to partners or other businesses. And so you would have a business dictating machine, record your message, and then will be on its way to the next business where they're able to play back on that business phonograph, more or less. Now, I will note by 1888, the American Graphophone Company was already more or less formed, really coming into the fold of the phonograph business. It would corner the market. Initially, that industry or company was made by Alexander Graham Bell and Charles Sumner, but eventually, how would you say, business owner, business mind, Jesse Lippincott would corner the market and establish that company or come to own that company, I would say. Though Lippincott was very focused on having the phonograph as a business device, the business would not do so well. And so by 1890, Thomas Edison would eventually seize control of the American Graphophone Company. And considering being the proprietor, he wanted to kind of, at least the mindset was to start over. The American Graphophone Company wasn't doing too well by that point in time. So by 1894, 1895, he would file for bankruptcy. But still, considering that Lippincott cornered the market with the graphophone phonograph market with that same industry, he still retained, or Edison at least, Edison retained his patents that went along with it and continued to innovate this device and invention. And so by January of 1896, the National Phonograph Company would be created, and this company would really jettison Edison into the turn of the 20th century. It's what we know of more or less when we think of the Edison phonograph, more or less. I will note, I made a note here of the spring phonograph models. Initially, Edison did come out with some electrical phonographs, more or less. I do get quite often a lot of questions about it. But it was quite expensive to make. And when thinking of having these phonographs on the market, you want to kind of cut costs, make things a little bit more affordable so that it could be open to a wider market. So he would bring out his spring-motored phonograph, his spring-motored phonograph, as well as other companies would also come out with their own spring-motored phonographs as well. Now, when it comes to the horn, now, considering that the phonograph was a business device, most often people used hearing tubes, which looked very much like earphones today, just wired earphones more or less, just the wire or hose was much more thick. And so the horn made little leeway in the 1880s, though it would have some development. By the early 1890s, Edison was already developing his own sets of horns that would be attached to these phonograph machines. There's also a huge pivot by, I would say, the early 1890s to have these phonographs jettison more towards entertainment phonographs or entertainment recordings, more or less. But even as they were developing, they still wanted to find that better horn, better sound, more clear sounding recording. And so that's how we get Charles Eichhorn. In June of 1905, he files for a patent for his own amplifying horn that I'll be discussing a little bit later. That would really help jettison at least our discussion on the painted pedaled phonograph horn, more or less. And so here I have a quote from the Phonoscope, which was kind of a phonograph and technological magazine of the turn of the 20th century. But here it says, the rise of the Edison phonograph is attributed to three factors: reduced costs, improvement of records, and the improvement of sound amplifying horns. Now, as I was saying just before, with the improving horn, having these mechanisms attached to more ornate or larger horns, it definitely did help the sound or the playback of these cylinder recordings. I will say initially the recordings on these cylinders only lasted about 2 minutes. Eventually we would get to 4 minutes in the next century. But kind of a rule of thumb, the larger the horn, the louder the sound, and more often than not, it could sometimes lean towards more clarity of sound. Now, often when we have these Edison horns or the ones that came as a base with the phonograph, they were usually made out of brass. There were a few other materials used, such as wood, paper mache. There's some more odd ones, ornate ones made out of glass, as well as wood. And so, usually from what I've heard or read in my readings, wooden horns were most often the best. It functioned more or less like a violin or a guitar. It added a really nice warm timbre. But still in that same thread, as with all technological innovations or markets, you would want to have more options for people to peruse over, to, have their eye on. Now, here on this slide, I have a couple of images. For one, on the left, I have an Edison standard phonograph and attached that horn there. That horn would eventually be coined the witch hat horn. And I like this photo because it kind of allows us to see more of the colors that were incorporated, how these horns would look. I will say we do have an Edison standard phonograph we play here in our museum, or we give demonstrations of, which is also why I included it as a nice Easter egg, more or less. But if you note in this horn, it has that black base and flared lip, kind of in more of a metallic color, which is why it was named the witch hat horn, more or less. And so here, these images off to the right, these two images showcase illustrations from a catalog from 1891. Now, this is within this phonograph catalog. This is one of Edison's phonograph catalogs. This was the first compilation or complete set of horns featured in a catalog. And so specifically, I want to point out reproducing horn number 5, which is above there. That horn would come to kind of evolve with time. It became quite popular in the next decade as a staple horn. Though I will say most often than not, and at least the phonographs I've seen today, I've seen much more witch hat horns that have survived. Yes. Now here, as I mentioned prior, Charles Eichhorn. Now Charles Eichhorn is developed this pedaled horn that you see here. This is his patent on the left-hand side by 1905. Now, considering Edison, he was a perfectionist. He wanted to look towards the next best thing. I will also note when it came to the phonograph business, Edison's mindset, he wanted to focus on quality rather than hyper stardom or popularization. He wanted to be known for the quality of his phonographs. And with these horns, these pedal horns that came out on market, they became more or less quite popular because when they were larger, they gave a nice sound in the recordings and they're quite beautiful. It would catch the, how'd you say, the customer's eye. And so often when it came with uh when I would say the relation to the Edison Phonograph Company and Charles Eichhorn, well, Eichhorn originally sells his patent to a manufacturer called the Tea-Tray Company. I will note there were quite a number of different companies that would, um, I would say, not necessarily sell these horns, but establish, make these horns. And so a few of them would be the Standard Metal Manufacturing Company, the New Jersey Sheet Metal Company, Hawthorne and Sheeble, Music Master, as well as the Tea-Tray Company. Now, when Charles Eichhorn does sell this patent to the Tea-Tray Company, he eventually does come to another deal in by 1906, 1907 with Thomas Edison, where he licensed his design to Edison, considering that Charles Eichhorn is the licensee of this design. There would be some complications later on by 1917 in regards to this horn, but nonetheless, it still took a hold when it came to the silhouette of these beautiful phonographs. Now here we are. Now here are some images of the painted pedal phonographs or phonograph horns that I've been speaking about or will be discussing throughout my discussion here, excuse me. But here on this slide, now off to the left in this grid, these are some painted phonograph horns that we have here in our collections. And off to the right, I wanted to include a phonograph of how these phonograph horns more or less would look like. I will note when it came to these larger horns, considering these mechanisms were, sometimes smaller than the horn itself, you would sometimes need assistance to support the horn. So you would quite often have a crane attached. Now, a crane was a metal rod that either kind of sat on the machine and went above the horn here, and two chains would come down, attach the horn, and more or less support the extra weight of this kind of extension on the mechanism. Sometimes these cranes would also be supported by either the table the phonograph was set on, or sometimes on the floor if the horn was large enough to have such a large crane attached to it. But I will say, part of the reason, at least when it comes to the Edison phonograph horn now, usually when Edison not usually, but when Edison did elaborate on these designs, on his end, it came usually in a single color. The most common colors I've seen are black and blue. With his fireside model, I've seen that it came in red. But what about these beautiful decorations? Well, these would come more or less with the Tea-Tray Company and a couple of other companies as well that wanted to elaborate more, have, as usual, as industries go, a little bit more of a standout display or model on the market to bring in more customers. And that's how we have these beautiful decorated phonograph horns come to market and be related to the Edison phonograph. Now, I will say when it comes to these decorations, I do have three questions I am going to highlight on in the rest of my presentation discussing their role in interior design. Now, for one, how did these horns fit with the design trends of the time? Secondly, why were these horns painted the way they were? And third, how did these trends affect the legacy of the painted horns? So here, now the evolution of interior design. I will say this was quite an exciting time for interior design. By the turn of the 20th century, the late 19th century, it's noted as an eclectic period because there was so much going on during this particular era. I will say by the turn of the 20th century, interior design really matured uh, with the, how would you say, larger accumulation or the possibility of including more photos and illustrations and books allowed the dissemination of a lot of interior design ideas to really take hold. And so that's how we have all of this eclectic taste going on, many different revivals happening during this period as well. Now here, I just have a few uh, movements that I'm going to be highlighting that I argue affected the reason why these homes were painted the way they were with these floral motifs and also the coloration that they were made in and how they eventually existed within the public. Now, the first one would be Orientalism. I will say the three movements that I'll be highlighting on are more Western focused. Orientalism does have its background in colonialism within the Western hemisphere or Western sphere, I would better say. Secondly, revivalism, as I've been alluding to, there were many revival movements occurring during this time simply because it was just such a new, different time. A lot of change was happening. Industrialization was taking hold, mass manufacturing, and I'll be discussing while we go over revivalism. And then the arts and crafts movement, which would kind of serve as a different reaction of the positivity that comes with industrialization, mass manufacturing. Arts and crafts kind of went the opposite way and would eventually affect the legacy of these painted horns here. Yes, now the era of revivalism. Now, here I will say, considering that we're coming out of the Victorian era in the 19th century, well, the Victorian era had many changes to it. Now, for one, the growing stresses and complications of industrialized society would eventually have people look towards the past. They want to emulate simpler times of the past that seemed much less complicated than how we were moving in the later half of the 19th century, moving past, at least here in the US, moving past the Civil War in the 1860s. We needed more or less a change, seeking a more national identity. So all of these different ideas of how imagery should be and motifs, design motifs should occur, really resonated during this time, especially with designers. So here on the slide, I do have some of the revivals that occurred listed here. So we have Colonial Revival, Neo-Greco, Greek, Rococo, Renaissance, Egyptian, Gothic, English, and French Revival, as well as Medieval. And that's only a handful of some of the revivals that took place during this period of time. It was really just a lot of reminiscing, I would say. Yes. Now, I will also mention considering that we were just getting to the part of, photos and illustrations being included in many of these design books and articles, many of these revival movements were not entirely accurate. They were usually more fantastical, to a certain degree. And so, considering that more often than not, designers would piece together different movements together, and it usually was quite opulent in accordance to Victorian tastes. So here in this image that I have showcased on the slide, we have this young Victorian woman and her pet there within this living room atmosphere. So I do want to point out there's a lot of floral motifs specifically happening. So we have it here in the wallpaper, within the tablecloth, the upholstery that you see, the rug area, even within the carvings of this, how would you say, drawer here, floral motifs, incredibly opulent. A very typical aspect of Victorian interior design is maximalism. You wanted to showcase your wealth, showcase that you are worldly, and so you would have all of these different motifs going on all at the same time to showcase a little bit more about yourself to your guests here. Now, I do want to mention this illustration that I have for you here. And so here, you might have also noticed it's more colorized, which I think helps elaborate the points a little bit better. On the flooring there, you have some, how would you see if you're able to see my mouse here? On the flooring here, there's some paneling, more or less, or emulated paneling that is very reminiscent of Rococo designs, more English French revival there. Even on the dressing table or armoire that's there, it's very French Rococo style. And considering the candelabras and the fantastical shape of this mirror there, but honing in once more the amount of floral motifs. Now, when thinking of the phonograph horn and the florals that you saw, it would go or pair quite nicely in one of these decorated homes. Now, the reason why we have such a tight grasp of these floral motifs, well, they have quite a historical precedence. Now, I will say roses do originally hail from Asia. That's where they're initially from. But with colonialism moving past, eventually it would have its own symbolic relevance in English and French designs specifically. A lot of the times when it came to these older Victorian showcases, it usually tried to showcase like old world knowledge, kind of more of this fantastical, opulent set of trends that you're able to get in on, that you're kind of one of the upper class there. I will also say in the Victorian era, bouquets became much more prevalent. They became kind of more geared towards social cues. So certain flowers had certain symbolic references, and it became in many of these, I would say, handbooks, I would say. Yes, handbooks that came out during that time that went over interior design and different, not interior design, but different house manners, I would say, of that period. They mention bouquets and that you should really start to incorporate them in the home as they fall into that trend of leaving messages for your guests that you're quite worldly or quite wealthy, considering. Now, I also mentioned here in this last note, still lifes. Still lifes became much more prevalent or higher on the ladder academically by the late 19th century, and usually these still lifes had some form of floral element or usually had some sense of fruits or whatnot. And incorporating a lot of these organic materials, it also helps showcase artists on the artist side, their different techniques or prowess that they're able to replicate such beauty or organic matter in, I would say, a more realistic way or realism. So here, excuse me. Now, I've chosen this example of a tea tray from 1880 that kind of also dates back to the tea tray company, what they were doing prior to manufacturing these floral petaled horns. And so here, I also do want to note on this tray there, that black background, which just highlights these floral components there. And so I've even had them or took screenshots of more up close detail that you're able to see all the coloration that's there. There's these many pastel colors, very soft, reflective. And so in comparing to one of these floral horns, now though these aren't made in necessarily the same style, these were probably done by two different artists, you could tell the similarities. The coloration of the roses that you see here, the leaves, these also, and considering the two images, the floral motifs, how they're composed or the composition of it, follows the shaping of the horn and tray, I would say. And so, in considering revivalism, having these flowers painted on the horns definitely followed the trend of this opulence, this beauty. Considering you would also have to buy these horns secondary, it wouldn't come as a staple or the base package of the phonograph. It also showcased that you were willing to put in much more of a investment to have it showcased in your room or in your parlor or wherever this phonograph was to be set up. Now, secondly, Orientalism. Now, I will say Orientalism has been around for quite a while. I would say by the 17th century, more or less. And the reason why I pointed out Orientalism specifically to answer that question, how were these horns painted? How were they colored? And more or less. And so here, the one word, Japanning. Now, Japanning is, as I have this definition here, imitations of lacquer and other decorative surfaces by European craftsmen using their own materials and techniques. Now, the reason why this dates back to the 17th century, well, trading through the continents from the Western Hemisphere as well as the Asian continent, or I would say more cultures considering, there was this love of, how would you say, chinoiserie, as well as this beautiful decorative varnish that would come along many of these artisan goods. And so, with time, many of these artisans would imitate it. And so, also have it here how the process would go more or less. You would start out with your base material or layer. You would then ground or put your layering of grounding and then have your varnish and decoration on top. Now, when it came to these more, how'd you say, illustrative surfaces, not illustrative surfaces, but designs, how would they draw these designs? From what I've read, I've seen one of two main possibilities. Now, when it comes to varnishing, especially furniture, they did use colored varnish or colored varnishing to add these more decorative components as such as painting roses or floral elements, more or less. I've also seen them use enamel paint, which I'm more partial to. I did see one other source site that they would sometimes use fruit dyes to paint these horns with, though I am not so confident in the fruit dye um, description, considering that with a lot of these floral horns, they don't really fade in color or design. They more or less chip much more often, so which makes me think of more enamel painting, different colored varnish. Um, that would probably be the culprit. I will note when it does also come to Orientalism, there is kind of another component that is much more fantastical and mythical. I have another definition here by the Cambridge Dictionary that says Orientalism is rooted in the globalization and imperial history of the Western world, that it predominantly defined as an inaccurate Western perspective that either romanticizes or mystifies depictions or ideas about regions of the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, and I would argue North Africa as well. So a lot of the times when it came to these japanned horns, or the incorporation of chinoiserie, as I mentioned previously, chinoiserie is essentially narrative scenes or naturescapes that were very prevalent in Asian designs that would then be disseminated into the Western Hemisphere or Western cultures that would more or less mystify uh, these depictions, I would say. Now, when it also came to these pedal horns and the influence of Orientalism, I do have a good example here as well on the slide. This is from a magazine in the Los Angeles Times in 1904 that's advertising for these horns that just came in. So here it reads, "We have just received a large shipment of phonograph horns, including some of the latest Eastern novelties, the new Morning Glory." Now, considering that these horns were coming out of New Jersey, in saying Eastern novelties, I would say or argue alludes more so towards the fact of this sort of mysticism that surrounded Orientalism and almost exoticism, I would say, on that end. And then when it comes to Edison, here, what I have depicted on the right of the slide, this is an image by Guernsey Moore. Guernsey Moore was an illustrator of the early 20th century that he would do many advertisements specifically in this 1900 from 1907 to 1908. But here he made one for the Edison phonograph. And if you note here, this woman, she's kind of very uh, I would say passive, has a very longing, inviting look. She's decorated in this robe that I would say alludes more so towards Chinese motifs. And then next to her is the Edison phonograph with this painted horn. Though in mentioning this ad, there is some controversy behind it. Now, Edison did not distribute these horns specifically from his own in-house facility. When I mean that, I mean specifically the painted floral horns. And so when they released this advertisement in magazines, many of his, I would say sellers or, yeah, sellers across the country became upset because people were asking for this horn and potentially it would not be on sale in their shops. And so they had to redesign the ad and have a black painted pedal horn added to this slide, or not to this slide, but added to the advertisement. And they also released a statement correcting that they did not supply them directly from in-house or that they might not be available in their area. Yes. So here on this next slide, I do have an example of both a japanned dresser, and it has some examples of chinoiserie that I mentioned earlier. Now, if you see on the drawers there, there are some narrative scenes that I mentioned in my description or definition. But also, if you notice on the doors here, there's further uh, floral motifs. I keep mentioning floral motifs, but this is all about flowers and to that degree of all of these flowers being showcased, beautifully drawn and decorated. Now, when it does come to this drawer, I also will note you might see that it's in the same coloration as, let's say, a witch hat horn. It's because they're pretty much decorated in the same way. Even with those black horns, they were still japanned. And in this, let's say this drawer here, this drawer was with this yellow coloration that's all gilded. So that's why it has those similar components, that similar coloration because of that black japanned varnishing as well as that metal gilded more or less component as well. Now, the arts and crafts movement. Now, here it gets, I would say, a little interesting. Now, when it comes to the arts and crafts movement, just as we had positive reactions to industrialization, mass manufacturing, more or less, with that positive reaction, I will note, it was here in the US, for the first time, we were able to go to department stores and buy theoretically a whole living room, like you would, let's say, at IKEA, that you go into one of these decorated false rooms and you're like, you know what, this looks great. I'm gonna buy the whole room. That it At this point in time, this is where we first get that kind of option. We also have mail order furniture taking root for the first time. But because of that, just as we do today, there was questions on the quality of mass manufactured furniture. How do artisans play a role in this new world of industrialization? And that's how we have the arts and crafts movement. Now, the arts and crafts movement was born in Britain, and considering that in the UK and Britain is where industrialization really takes root, it's quite understandable. But the arts and crafts was meant to take or meant to be against the mechanical and impersonal nature of this industrialization and mass manufacturing. It was meant to kind of put these designs back in the hands of artisans and designers, craftsmen. Yes. Now, I will say, when it comes to establishing the arts and crafts movement, one of the figures that would lead this sense of, I would say, revival for human sake was John Ruskin. Now, Ruskin was a writer on art and design in Britain during this period. He would go against the maximalist look that was very popular in the Victorian era and believed specifically simpler living was much healthier. Yes. As he said in his own words, I know what it is to live in a cottage with a deal floor and roof and a hearth of mica slate, and I know it to be in many respects healthier and happier. So needless to say, he was adamantly against mass manufacturing or mass-produced furniture. Now, specifically Ruskin, when it kind of ties in with the eclecticism of this era, he was very much for the revival of the Middle Ages, the Gothic era, medieval periods. Um, Besides the architectural elements, he found that it also reflected a sense of good moral values. Bring back a lot more of these standards or at least medieval or Middle Age standards, and he wasn't alone. Now, writers A.W.N. and Pudgeon wrote a book on Gothic style called The True Principles of Pointed or Christian Architecture, which went exactly with that same code, that this sense of architecture design, interior design, reflected good moral codes within the home. But I will say, as well, Ruskin wrote his own books. He wrote The Seven Lamps of Architecture and The Stones of Venice as well. But I mentioned Ruskin, but he wouldn't be considered the founding father of the arts and crafts movement. The father of the arts and crafts movement would be William Morris, as I mentioned here. Oh, excuse me. There we go. I will point out, before I move on a little bit more into William Morris's ideas, this illustration here. Now, this illustration was designed initially by William Burgess and was painted by Axel Hermann Haig. William Burgess was a architect during this period. He also was very into or interested in John Ruskin's position in the Gothic period, the Middle Ages. And so if you see this living room area here, or library, better put, this is a design of a potential design of his own home, which would be then called the Tower House. Unfortunately, William Burgess dies relatively young. He will die a year after this watercolor is released on exhibition in 1881. And still, his tower home was completed. It was built. His library does look very much like this design here, but I will note some of these elements that you see here, the same ornamental, almost like filigree elements on the back walling there. Along this relief above the fireplace is a castle that has figures uh, decorated in Middle Age costuming, more or less. These beautiful inlaid roofs, everything kind of still going into that revival, historical, reminiscing era. But when it comes to William Morris, now William Morris was still in the same route, loved that Gothic and medieval ages, but he specifically was a textile artist, and he adamantly advocated for interior design and production of furniture and furnishings as a valid enterprise for the architect and fine artist. In his words, he would say, turn our artists into craftsmen and our craftsmen into artists. I will say, in the same breath, William Burgess also referred to himself as kind of an art architect of the same caliber, considering. Yes. Now, here I also have showcased another image of what would be an arts and crafts room. So, a lot of components that are popular in the arts and crafts room are open floor plans, exposed wood, artisan goods. And so this image, or this room, was originally designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. He is, I would say, the figure who brought in the prairie style, a huge component of the arts and crafts movement. Now, considering you have all of this open space, this beautiful, gorgeous design. Frank Lloyd Wright was well known for designing even his own furniture, which is true within this room here as well. Where does the horn fit in? Where do these phonographs fit in? Well, that's in part how the legacy of the phonograph horn follows through from this point. Now, the fall of the painted pedaled horn. Now, considering that the painted pedal horn, it came out, about 1906, 1907, becoming much more popular after Charles Eichhorn receives that patent in 1905. It also served a good purpose for at least the Edison Phonograph Company. By that point, 1904, more or less, they were looking for a horn that had a much better sound, and the pedal horn, that was it. But in considering how you would have to attach these horns to the phonograph, they jutted into the room. So if you have these open floor plans and having this horn jut into the room, it's going to kind of ruin that eye line, take your eyes away from the different artisan goods that are surrounded. I will say another component of the arts and crafts room was to have one streamlined look. And so here. By 1909, Edison will introduce the signet horn to the public. It was patented by one of Edison's inventors, quite an important figure in his business, Peter Weber. Now, these signet horns, a large change that we have from the painted pedaled horn, or the morning glory horn, as it's also referenced to, the way that it's a little bit more less, or I would say less intrusive in the room. It curves in on itself, as you see here in this image. They have this crane that is almost hidden behind the horn. But even with this, it kind of just sits above the phonograph, so it's not as in depth in the room. I will say when it comes to these signet horns, Edison would go through a couple of other distributors here. I've most often see these signet horns be produced by Music Master by this point. Now, when it comes to the signet horn, were they painted with these floral motifs that I've showcased? And they will not. They usually came in either solid colors, such as black. I've seen some in blue. They would also come in wood, which was the expensive option. Now, considering that wooden horns were quite expensive, another more common occurrence that would happen, you would buy an Edison Signet horn and it would sometimes be painted to look like wood. And so this horn that you see here, that was done to it to kind of appear as at least a more highbrow, more expensive option. I will also note, I believe this kind of streamlining of the colors and decorations is in relation to the arts and crafts movement. I just want to point out this other photo. Imagining a wooden Edison Signet horn, it's much easier to imagine it in this room versus one of these more brightly colored floral horns. Though they're still, I would say I might be biased, but I believe the petal tones are still beautiful in their own right. Now, I will say, even these external horns, the Signet horn, it's less intrusive. It's still a a nuisance to customers. And that's how we get furniture models. Now, when do we finally lose the external horn? When does it finally disappear? By 1913, Edison will focus on manufacturing more of these furniture-like models, not only in part for the horn. The market also had shifted less towards a cylinder phonograph and more towards the disc phonograph. Now, the disc, or I would say the technology behind the disc phonograph that we often see in movies and entertainment, more or less, that came out not too long after the cylinder phonograph was invented, probably by the late 1880s, 1888, somewhere around there, the gramophone is made. But there was a few, I would say, improvements that the disc phonograph had that the cylinder didn't. For one, you had 6 minutes of recording on either side of the disc, at least in the earlier years. So you got a little bit more bang for your buck than one 4-minute cylinder. Also, storage. It was much easier to store these discs rather than drawers filled with Edison cylinders. Now, I will say, after the disc phonograph kind of hammers in on the market. Edison, he had his own number of competitors as well. He had Columbia and Victrola. Now, a large component when it comes to the fall of the painted pedals horn, how Edison was or was reacted to the market, and he often reacted late. Now, Victrola had been making these furniture models since 1906, so he had the jump on Edison. Edison, in part, he was, I would say, more or less stubborn in considering jumping towards the next step, which would be the disc. And so then when it comes to these furniture models moving through the company, more or less the fall of the painted pedal horn, where did the Edison Phonograph Company lead to after their jump here? Well, it doesn't end well for the Edison Phonograph division, or at least the entertainment division. After he introduces these furniture-like models by 1913, I will note we're heading into World War I. Now, after World War I, we do have a post-war depression, and the Edison phonograph industry or business does not fare well. From what I've read from Charles Edison's memoir, they had to make quite severe cuts within the phonograph company, not only because of trying to survive the post-war depression, but also trying to reevaluate their leadership, branches of leadership throughout the company as well that made some unfortunate financial decisions by that point. Though, from what I've read, after World War I, the Edison phonograph industry, or the National Phonograph Company, does not recuperate the way that it wishes it did. So by the time we get to the radio in 1929, or the late 1920s, I would say by 1927, Edison, he also is late to the game. And so by 1929, the Edison Phonograph entertainment division, at least, would close, in part also because of the impending Great Depression in the 1930s. That would put a damper on the business as well. But what is the honest legacy of the painted pedal horn even after the entertainment phonograph division is closed? Now, here I have this wonderful example by Norman Rockwell. This is called Dreams of Long Ago. Now, Norman Rockwell is an illustrator. He is known predominantly as reflecting the American dream. He would commonly work with different magazines, at least in this 1920s period, to provide social commentary or for these beautiful illustrations on American society. So specifically, this one, Dreams of Long Ago, was made for the Saturday Evening Post. It was created August 13th, 1927. I will say, Rockwell had a very long-standing relationship with the Saturday Evening Post. He made hundreds of drawings or illustrations for that magazine as well. But here in this particular depiction, now there's many different nostalgic points of reference here. For one, we have this cowboy dressed up, kind of having a very friendly position, kind of just having his head on his hand, looking at the viewer as if they're in on the same message, the same reminiscing of simpler times. I will note in the 1920s, both cowboys and country music made headways during this period as well, which I think is predominantly what it's referencing. But next to the cowboy is that beautiful painted phonograph horn. Now, the mechanism that it's attached to is not an Edison phonograph, though I still think it relates to our topic today or this during this discussion. Now, specifically, why this illustration is called Dreams of Long Ago, it is of the disc that that cowboy is holding. And Dreams of Long Ago is a song. Specifically, it's sung by Italian tenor Enrico Caruso. And one of the lyrics in the song that I find quite interesting, it reads, "Shadows are falling and I sit alone, my heart recalling memories when you were my own." And in having this depiction here, the cowboy, the disc, the phonograph there, it's including all of these elements as part of this intense reminiscing of this period of time, especially moving through the 1920s. We've also come to different design motifs. Art Nouveau makes waves, Art Deco really takes hold. So considering all the glitz and glamours that we often think of the 1920s, this stands in stark contrast to that period. And so with that, I will say, I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion. I've also hoped that with this discussion, it kind of showcases how these painted phonograph horns not only serve as a marker of the Edison Phonograph Company, but also serve as a marker of the brightest point of Edison's phonograph history as well. And so here, I want to thank you once again. I do have a couple of my sources here. I will say we do have a number of different presentations that we have listed on our YouTube site. I do want to also give notice later on this month, we're going to have another discussion labeled "Oh Say Can You See," which discusses more of Francis Scott Key, Fort McHenry, and the Star Spangled Banner as well. But yes, I do hope that you've enjoyed once again this discussion. If you would like to look at it as again, we will have it posted on our YouTube site. And yes, I do hope you enjoy the rest of your day and hope to see you soon.